Before we begin, I'd like to give a quick shout out to Jason Williams on Facebook. This talented artist is crafting his very own graphic novel on Jason Voorhees vs. Batman. His art style is great and I'm super excited to see the finished product. So if you would like to support this guy's work, I've left a link for you all in the description box down below, as well as the crowdfunder on Indiegogo. Please feel free to share these links with anyone and everyone who you think might enjoy. Now on with the video. Not all killers are crafted in the same fashion. Some are born into this world to be cursed from the very beginning. Others may be a victim of the unfortunate circumstances of life. Pamela Voorhees would give birth to one of these souls. Having spent years married to her abusive husband Elias, Pamela received a glimmer of light when she became pregnant. Desperate for freedom and a painless life for her baby, Pamela murdered her husband and prepared for her son's arrival, whom she named Jason. Though her boy was born disfigured, Pamela's love for him would be immortalized forever. Sadly, however, the flowering shield of her love could not protect her son from the inevitable reality of life's relentless cruelty. Throughout his childhood, Jason struggled to make friends. In an effort to resolve this issue, his mother sent him to the summer camp at Crystal Lake. Due to the neglect of the camp's counselors, Jason was thrown into the lake. Unable to swim, his short and depressing life ended beneath a watery grave. Distraught by these events, Pamela sought out to pursue a violent course of justice. She too would eventually meet an unceremonious end after one of her first crusades. However, just as her love for her son would not cease, neither would her work. Returning from his dampened tomb, Jason was reborn, and as such, sought out to continue his mother's work. Time after time, year after year, he would cut a bloody swath through the abandoned campgrounds and the surrounding forest, haunting Crystal Lake. Though his victims would always manage to barely bury him, he would always reawaken to continue the work of the only person who ever showed him the love that he needed. His unnatural escapades would lead him to many strange places, some of which were out of this world. He would clash with the demon Freddy Krueger. He would even cross blades with the boisterous Ash Williams. Jason eventually became attuned to the bitter taste of revenge and sour defeat. Weary when living, and unable to rest when dead, Jason Voorhees is a murderer molded by misfortune and an unyielding desire to honor the memory of his mother and distribute vicious retribution to those who would set foot in his would-be home of solitude. Humans are no strangers to war. After all, we've been fighting for as long as we can remember. But battle bores bloodshed, and with bloodshed comes the crushing reality of loss. But what if we didn't have to fight? What if we could build machines to fight for us? Skynet was an artificial intelligence neural network created for this very purpose. A technological marvel, this computer appeared to be humanity's savior. Or so we thought. 3 billion human lives ended on August 29, 1997. The survivors christened this tragic event Judgment Day. Caused by the very thing designed to keep us safe, mankind was brought to the brink of extinction by a calculated form of treachery. Skynet, the very thing we had designed to keep us safe, had become self-aware. With its newfound consciousness, the system launched the world's nuclear missiles and orchestrated a war against humanity. But war cannot be fought without soldiers, and soldiers cannot fight without a leader. Our leader is John Connor. Destined to save mankind from the error of its mistakes, John led his fellow survivors against the mechanized troops that Skynet had constructed, Terminators. Advanced warriors, these emotionless monstrosities would pave their way through the very fabric of time itself to destroy their most sought-after enemy. For you see, war can be waged before it even begins. Having managed to unravel the mysteries of time travel, Skynet would send Terminators back through what we perceive as time in an effort to eliminate Connor. The first was sent to the year 1984 to strike at John's mother, Sarah. It failed, but as with many things in life, there are a select few events that can never be avoided, for Judgment Day is inevitable. For this year's Halloween special, I decided to bring back two characters that have had some of the most controversial matchups on my channel. I must admit that while I do still stand by the verdicts presented in each of the previous videos, I could have improved upon my rundowns and explanations. This is exactly what I plan on doing today with our altercation of the unkillable. For Jason, our analysis of the character will draw from his appearances within the Friday the 13th movies, and their tie-in material, such as comic books, novels, and so on. We will also do the same for the Terminator, but just to be clear, we are using the original T-800 from its appearance in the first movie, as well as Terminator Genesis. We will also acknowledge the abilities of his brethren, as displayed in the series movies and comics alike. This is one that I've been looking forward to for a while, so I hope you all enjoy the altercation between the unkillable, Jason Voorhees, and the Terminator.
Round 1.
Jason Voorhees possesses terrifying levels of physical power. For the first 3 movies in which he took on the role as the series' main antagonist, he was in fact still human. Even at this time, his strength was disturbingly impressive. He could crush skulls beneath his grip, and was able to keep going for a brief time after receiving an axe wound to the head. From Part 6 onwards, Jason effectively became something of a zombie. After this, his abilities were increased tenfold. I did once state that he was able to punch clean through solid steel doors. However, this was a mistake on my behalf, as the feat comes from the short comic story where he fights Leatherface, and thus this achievement is to be considered non-canon, even if I do believe it to be an accurate representation of his strength. With his newfound strength, the Crystal Lake Killer could send others flying with the power of his throws and punches as if they were mere tennis balls, as can be seen in both of his fights with Freddy Krueger. He has further demonstrated his supernatural might with his ability to effortlessly smash apart cars and flip them over. Furthermore, he can casually impale multiple targets at once, has swung a helicopter blade as if it were a baseball bat, and can even slice his machete through solid steel. Although Jason is not typically known for his speed, he is known to be relentless when outnumbered. He can also make use of reasonably well-timed dodges and intercept hits from his victims, and has on one occasion managed to evade a speeding van. But most impressive of all was his unnatural durability, which was bolstered by a moderate healing factor. The movies alone don't place much emphasis on his regenerative ability, likely as a result of the limits of technology when the movies came out, as well as the need to focus on the horror aspects of the films. As a result, it can be hard to determine the upper levels of its potential. However, we can infer that this ability to heal grants him an increased level of sustainability and longevity, a principle that I would liken to the healing factor of DC Comics' Deathstroke. As such, Jason could soak up stabbing wounds and countless rounds of gunfire like water to a sponge. Furthermore, he has been relatively unfazed by the loss of his arm, or when exposed to high temperature extremes, such as when he was frozen solid and soon after set ablaze, barely slowing down in the process. And this also goes for when he withstood high amounts of voltage that were potent enough to kill ordinary beings, as well as being tossed around by Krueger like a rag doll. Thanks to his healing factor, Jason has been able to recover from having his eyes stabbed out, and even withstood a grenade blowing a hole in his chest, and began to heal almost instantly. But his most impressive achievement of all comes from his first fight with Freddy, when the demon dropped a boiler on him, and then he proceeded to effortlessly flip it off himself. This doesn't appear to be too impressive at first glance, until we take a look at the novel. The book states that this boiler weighed 10 tons, so Jason's ability to withstand the force of something so heavy speaks volumes. But there is more to it than that, as the novel also states, and I kid you not, that this boiler was as hot as the Earth's molten core. The novel goes on to explain that while Jason may have underestimated Freddy's willpower in the dream world, it was Krueger who had in fact underestimated Jason's willpower in any world. In other words, Jason's body is merely an extension of his will, and thus he is barely fazed by all but the most devastating of attacks. The Terminator is a near-perfect soldier thanks to the merits of many of its abilities, and its physical performance is no exception. As you might expect, these mechanical monstrosities possess superhuman levels of strength. They could effortlessly throw and even kill humans with the force of their power alone. Furthermore, when the T-800, affectionately known as Pops, collided with the original T-800, the force of their strength caused the concrete beneath them to crumble. Pops would later hold up a multi-ton school bus dangling over a bridge with one hand. Remember, this comes from an older T-800, so this should be well within the scope of the original too, especially when we consider that all members of this model were built to the same design specifications. This immense power has also allowed various members of the model to rip apart their T-600 predecessors, break down steel doors, and has allowed their T-850 cousin to hold up a closing multi-ton blast door with one hand. A feat that should, for all intents and purposes, be within the scope of an 800's abilities, especially when we consider that the 850 was damaged and only using one arm. On the subject of the T-600s, the 800s were built to be 20% lighter, and as such weighed 400 pounds, which granted them greater mobility and increased running speed. Though Terminators didn't rely on their speed as much as their strength, they could still outgun multiple assailants all the while in pursuit, and initiate their counterattacks within the blink of an eye. But their most prominent attribute came from their near untouchable levels of durability. The endoskeleton was comprised of a unique metal known as hyperalloy, which was coated in living human tissue and blood. Though the machines could detect any damage done to their outer shell, it did not faze them. Neither did most attacks for that matter. Consequently, they could withstand near insurmountable quantities of gunfire and explosives, with only the most well-placed of them doing any serious damage. Only high-caliber shots, such as those fired from a 50 caliber sniper rifle, could do any serious damage. In addition, T-800s could easily withstand being thrown from speeding vehicles, and were barely slowed down by the disintegrating effects of acid. They could also endure through high temperature extremes, such as when John Connor expels one to molten steel and then soon after froze it in place, and yet after thawing out, it continued to function as if it had come straight off the assembly line. The only true vulnerability possessed by the T-800 was to EMPs and plasma-based attacks, which we will discuss in more detail later. It is worth noting, however, that they could withstand some exposure to high voltage, depending on the intensity of the current and the duration of exposure. To say the least, the physical properties of a single Terminator makes it an extremely daunting adversary to face off against, let alone a whole army of them. This one is tricky, as I can honestly see an argument being made for either opponent. On the one hand, the Terminator is likely the faster of the two, with superior running speeds and quite possibly reaction timing. However, I don't personally believe that this would be enough to tip the scales in its favour. Jason is more than able to hold out against attacks from faster and even stronger opponents until he can buy himself an opening. Comparing their strength is tough, as while the Terminators have more showings on the higher ends of the spectrum, the showings Jason has do put him on a similar playing field, and his achievements on the lower end of the scale are ultimately greater in number. I also believe that both possess enough strength to damage the other, given their ability to go toe-to-toe with opponents that are even more powerful than themselves. Where they differ is in their durability. On the one hand, I believe the Terminator possesses a slightly higher level of baseline durability, whereas Jason's ability to heal grants him a greater level of sustainability and longevity, the latter of which being a benefit that the Terminator has no real counter for. A physical contest between these two is likely to be a war of attrition, and while neither has any real limit to how long they can fight for, I believe that Jason's supernatural ability to recover from damage and paranormal levels of strength to be of greater benefit. Therefore, I will be awarding a very slight edge to Jason Voorhees in the category of physical abilities.
Round 2.
Jason is more of a stalker and a hunter than he is a fighter, as can be seen by how he tends to prefer picking off his victims one by one. This method has served him well throughout his career, if you can call it that. Jason's proficiency at stealth is so astute that he is able to skulk around in the shadows and get the drop on fully trained military and security personnel. As someone who is known to occasionally employ traps, Jason would also occasionally detect traps that had been laid out for him, which are for the most part the main ways in which he is defeated, but more on that shortly. When stalking his prey, he would cause distraction and confusion among his targets. This includes tactics such as cutting the power to a building occupying his victims, or in my personal favourite example, when he managed to escape confinement during the intro scene to Jason X. In this movie, Jason starts out restrained in a government facility. When his captors returned to inspect him, it was discovered that Jason had managed to break free and used another body as bait. Then, in the confusion, he brought down everyone around him. This also shows that despite his lack of education, Jason was surprisingly intelligent. In one-on-one fights, he could make use of the environment and use it to his advantage, turning almost anything into a lethal weapon, which has made for some very creative kills. He didn't just use the environment, he also manipulated it. In one instance, he threw his machete into the branch of a tree, causing it to break and lower the fallen helicopter into the vicinity of his next victim, allowing its still rotating blades to slice his victim into pieces. This also shows his natural affinity for accuracy. Though he's not known to be trained, or perhaps even practiced, he has shown a near consistent ability to hit his prey at long range with things such as harpoon guns and even his machete. When in an actual confrontation, Jason's main tactic was to take advantage of his supernatural strength and durability. He would employ a very aggressive hack and slash sequence with his machete that has allowed him to cut a bloody swath through scores of soldiers, all the while relying on his durability to soak up any damage that got through. When outnumbered, he would also occasionally use his victims as shields and use their own weapons against them. As I said earlier, most of Jason's defeats have been the result of his enemies luring him into traps. This has led many to believe that Jason is effectively easy pickings, because he has more often than not been taken down by young adults with little to no training. However, what a grand majority of these people are neglecting to realize is that Jason's defeats have only ever been made possible because his enemies have been able to plan ahead of time and learn his weaknesses. Both of these factors derive from something known as plot convenience, since they tend to get picked off individually and the protagonists are ultimately informed of who and what Jason is. This ultimately gives them knowledge prior to their final encounter with him, and thus gives them an advantage. These factors are not something that should affect his ability to win in a versus matchup, as neither character is granted prior knowledge of the battle. In terms of his actual achievements, Jason has gone up against Freddy Krueger, not once, but twice. The first battle ultimately being an impasse, only ending in his defeat because Freddy managed to accidentally stumble upon an apparent weakness. The second was largely even, and neither really emerged victorious, unless you count Jason being more intact at the end. He has also held his own against the much more experienced Ash Williams, and even participated in a lengthy and vicious altercation with his much stronger and more robust counterpart, Uber Jason. All in all, Jason Voorhees is a monster to square off against, even for those with greater experience and are more optimized for battle, a statement to which many of his victims would testify. The T-800 was Skynet's most promising cyborg at the time of its creation. Programmed with an extensive database of military knowledge and strategies, the Terminators were bred for combat. They possess files on several martial arts, or perhaps even all martial arts, if you want to take into account the reference made by the T-800 that appeared as a guest character in Mortal Kombat 11. However, while they do possess an extensive knowledge base, they do not appear to employ any advanced martial ability themselves. This could be a result of lacking ability from the limitations of programming, or simply an inability due to the weight of their cybernetic frame. It could also simply be because they were designed to fight humans, and with their superior physical power, wouldn't really need to. Despite this, Terminators do employ simpler degrees of basic hand-to-hand combat, relying on anticipation of the enemy's attacks and taking advantage of their built-in strength. Combined with their extensive knowledge of tactics, T-800s and their 850 cousins could calculate the most likely response from their human enemies, which could ultimately allow them to apply the most appropriate response. Since they were intended to be foot soldiers, Terminators excelled in the use of firearms, both old and new. This was bolstered by their ability to calculate the trajectory of their shots from faraway distances. The Terminator's ability to apply such tactics was a boon awarded thanks to their CPU. This chip is a learning computer. The more contact a Terminator has with humans, the more they learn. However, since the original Terminator had little contact with humans, and only ever spoke with direct purpose, there wouldn't have been much for it to learn. By contrast, something it could take advantage of was its files on human anatomy, which made him and his brethren more efficient killers, multiplying the number of ways in which they could terminate subjects. This also extends to their ability to detect the weaknesses in others, such as when a T-800 managed to pinpoint a weak spot in Marcus Wright, his heart, and thus struck it to remove him from the fight. Though the battlefield was the environment in which a Terminator excelled the most, the use of stealth was just as applicable to their skill set, appropriate since they were also intended to be infiltration units. As such, they were adept in the use of ambush and distraction-like tactics. A good example being when one mimicked the voice of Kyle Reese to lure John Connor out of hiding, a technique future models would adopt in their own fashion. One final thing to note on the specific T-800 that we are using in this video is the fact that it was not reprogrammed by the Resistance before being sent back in time, as it was the first Terminator to be deployed in this way. The Terminators that were reprogrammed ultimately fought with some degree of restraint against human opponents, including the second 800, even before it was ordered by John not to kill. Our Terminator does not share this restraint, and as can be seen from its fight with Pops, is more likely to resort to more lethal and brutal tactics. This will essentially allow it to take full advantage of its strengths in a manner most of his time-traveling comrades could not. To summarize, the term Terminator is perhaps the most fitting title that could be bestowed upon a machine so deadly. This section was fairly straightforward. However, it's not as landslided as one might initially think. The Terminator has a definite edge in terms of its knowledge base, and perhaps even technical skill. However, some of the abilities it can use against its human adversaries would ultimately be negated by Jason simply being undead. Considering the fact that he technically isn't alive, and that only some parts of his body appear to be functional, I believe it to be unlikely for the Terminator to effectively predict Jason's actions. Surprisingly, they are in fact very similar in a few areas. Both have exceptional degrees with accuracy and long-range precision, though the Terminator gets a slight edge here for consistency. The same can be said in terms of hand-to-hand combat, since when fighting opposition of similar physical ability to themselves, both rely on similar methods to get the job done. The Terminator, however, does seem to be a tad more assertive in his technique. Whereas Jason might wait for an opening, the Terminator will force one. If I were to give Jason any advantage, it would be for his use of stealth, since he is much more reliant upon it, and his affinity for its use is excellent. However, the Terminator does have the means to snuff him out, thanks to its ability to scan the environment. That is, of course, until we consider some of Jason's more supernatural abilities. Regardless, in terms of pure ability, neither really holds any significant advantage over the other, due to their vast degree of similarities. Though considering the fact that the Terminator is more optimized for a direct fight, along with its greater technical skill and the knowledge base it can pull from, he will earn a slight edge for his fighting abilities.
Round 3.
Jason can make use of a variety of weapons and supernatural abilities for his bloody crusade. His most prominent and iconic weapon is, of course, his machete. A simple instrument, it was typically used by survivalists and farmers alike, with a blade that was roughly 30 to 45 centimeters in length. While a dangerous piece of equipment on its own, when in the hands of someone as strong as Jason, its lethality was exponentially increased. He occasionally made use of other various hardware and similar weapons, ranging, but not limited to, axes, hacksaws, spear guns, as well as practically anything he could get his hands on. As for his supernatural powers, Jason was especially adept. Perhaps the most well known was his apparent ability to teleport. This supernatural power allowed Jason to inexplicably appear in front or behind his prey in a moment's notice, which also reinforced his skills in stealth. It is worth noting, however, that he tends to rely on this more for surprise attacks, or when he is giving chase, rather than using it in an actual fight. Jason is also able to sense his targets when they are in close proximity, effectively granting him a slight boost to his spatial awareness. Lastly, his most unusual ability, and one that he didn't use in fights, but that I'm bringing up for the sake of being thorough, was his ability to possess people. When possessing someone, Jason's will ultimately grants them a portion of his physical power, though not to the same degree as his own. This power can be achieved through his mask or through his yummy heart. Long story. As a side note, it was confirmed by Adam Marcus, the director for Jason Goes to Hell, that he is in fact a Deadite, which would ultimately explain his supernatural powers, and explains why he once had possession of the Necronomicon, all but signalling the connection between the franchises that the book appears in. As you might expect from one so horrifyingly powerful, Jason is well equipped for his killing sprees, both physically and metaphysically. The Terminator has wielded a variety of weapons over the course of the first movie. For the purposes of this matchup, we'll use the same guns that he did during the raid on the police station. The first was his Spaz 12 shotgun, a high-powered close-range weapon. This firearm fired out 12-gauge shells which dealt devastating damage at close range and hit with maximum impact. The Terminator had also removed the weapon's folding stock, making it less encumbered when wielding the weapon in tandem with his other gun, the Armalite AR-18. This fully automatic weapon typically fired 5.56 by 45mm ammunition at a rapid rate, allowing for extended amounts of suppressing fire. Though he didn't wield any handguns during the assault, I will also award him the benefits of the Hardballer 45. With a high level of firepower and laser sight for added precision, this weapon provided heavy damage in a compact package. Of course, the Terminator was not limited to the weapons of yesteryear, but also had several built-in features worth mentioning. The first was its ability to scan the environment to analyze its surroundings and seek out hidden prey. Like I said earlier, it could scan its opponents for weaknesses, granting more options in battle. As mentioned previously, its CPU was a learning computer, which gave it the ability to learn more about the world and humans with increased exposure. However, when sent out alone, the switch would be set to read only, so that they don't, in Sarah's own words, do too much thinking. As the T-800 was designed to be an infiltration unit, one of its most impressive functions was its ability to read and flawlessly mimic the voices of others, even after only hearing a few lines of dialogue. This is what allowed for the aforementioned feat of luring John Connor out of hiding, and allowed the first 800 to trick Sarah into giving it the location of her hideout. The flesh covering the endoskeleton was entirely organic, yet it healed at a faster rate than regular human tissue. On the whole, the Terminator is well equipped for both battle and infiltration, a mechanical being that laid out the foundation for future models. This section is rather interesting to compare, as each of these characters' choices in weapons and the abilities they make use of are almost complete opposites of one another. When comparing weapons, the Terminator has more of a practical advantage, given his ability to attack from any range, whereas Jason would have to get in close to do any real damage. While I do agree with the notion that Jason's weapons would normally be ineffective against the robust alloy of the Terminator's endoskeleton, Jason's massive amounts of strength effectively increase the danger they pose, though this does result more from his physical power, which I've already detailed, as opposed to the benefits of the weapons themselves. Remember when I said that the Terminator can effectively nullify Jason's use of stealth? Well, this only really applies if Jason relies on the more basic uses of it. However, with his ability to manifest anywhere in the environment, this essentially means that he can get the drop on his opponent before the Terminator is able to fully scan their surroundings, so Jason gets the edge there. The Terminator might be able to distract Jason by using the voice of another human being, though any advantage this could grant would ultimately be temporary. Jason's possession powers obviously wouldn't work against a machine, so they are null and void, as well as maybe his added degree of sense, since he's fighting a machine and not another human being. At the end of the day, I consider Jason's power to teleport to be a more useful edge than the Terminator's firearms, as it offers more options and doesn't have a limit, as opposed to the limited ammo count of his mechanical adversary. So with that in mind, I award a slight edge to Jason Voorhees for having the more usable special abilities.
Round 4.
Jason doesn't have any real physical weaknesses to speak of. His only real deficiencies are psychological, meaning that they affect his mind, one of which being his mother. There have been a few instances over the course of the series where the surrounding characters have been able to divert his attention and distract him by making him believe that his mother is present. Of course, this only works for as long as one is able to deceive him. Otherwise, if he is ever able to see through their trickery, any advantage that they gain is lost. The second weakness that many believe Jason to possess is water, a notion that I disagree with. This supposed weakness comes from his first fight with Freddy, in which he accidentally stumbles across an apparent fear buried within Jason's mind. My issue with this is that it is not consistent with the rest of Jason's showings. There are several examples over the course of the series where he has been submerged in water, even willingly entering large bodies of water, and he's completely fine. Even being on board a sinking ship, and the next time we see him, he's completely unfazed, having either walked on the seabed or swam to New York. The closest showing, besides his encounter with Freddy, comes from the end of the 8th movie, in which he displays fear at the sight of a large body of sewage water rushing towards him, similar to how Freddy poured water on him in their fight. The only reason I can think of for this is that having water crash into him reminded him of the extreme trauma he experienced when he originally drowned. Besides that, this apparent fear doesn't really line up with the rest of the series, and could potentially be considered a continuity error, or even a plot device. In either case, any perceived weakness on Jason's part directly affects his mind. and is only ever exploitable if his enemy has information on his abilities, or if they are able to somehow stumble across them by chance. The Terminator doesn't have any major drawbacks to speak of, as it was designed as the near-perfect enforcer. One of its main drawbacks would be the hydrogen fuel cells, its primary power source. Though these implements could last for 120 years, if they were ruptured beyond repair, they would become unstable and could result in a massive explosion that would completely destroy the cyborg, their power being so destructive that John Connor would describe them as nuclear. With an extensively durable alloy protecting these cells, the main weakness to the model was plasma-based attacks, which would pass through and directly damage the cells. EMPs and the occasional electrical discharge could also prove troublesome for the machine, as they would disrupt its ability to properly function with prolonged exposure. Beyond these slight setbacks, the Terminator is a near-flawless enforcer, of which only the most prepared and knowledgeable of soldiers can defeat. I'm going to be honest with you guys, I mostly made this section because I wanted to address the water issue with Jason that I had failed to take into account for my first video featuring the character. With that said, I don't see this section playing a massive role in the overall verdict. However, I do feel that one of these two has a slight edge over the other. Interestingly, the weaknesses of these two are complete opposites. Jason's are psychological, whereas the Terminator's are physical. Neither would be able to take advantage of these crutches without prior knowledge of their opponent, something I never allow in my videos. However, in a fight on neutral ground, Jason's weaknesses are completely unexploitable without prior knowledge, whereas with the Terminator, there is an ever so slight chance that Jason may be able to damage the fuel cells if he is able to cause significant damage to the machine. To be clear, this is only something that he could benefit from by chance. Despite this, having a minor chance to exploit your enemy's weakness still beats your enemy having no way of doing the same to you. Therefore, Jason Voorhees gets a very minor edge for having the less exploitable weaknesses.
Final round.
Both Jason Voorhees and the Terminator were killers born from the resulting tragedy of mankind's greatest mistakes. Jason stemming from neglect and rejection. The Terminator created due to the unending pursuit of more imaginative ways of self-destruction. As such, both became ruthless killers without knowing any better. Jason simply sought to honor the memory and avenge the one person who ever showed him love. And the Terminator was a soulless construction, lacking empathy, that could only follow the directives it was programmed with. The final tally for this fight is a slim 6 out of 10 majority to the victor. I believe that this fight would be a lengthy and brutal war of attrition, a tussle between zombie and cyborg. It would look fairly similar to the brawls these characters had with Freddy, Uber Jason, Pops, and the second Terminator's encounters with the T-1000. The arena for this contest will be a multi-story parking lot at night, with cars scattered throughout. In the opening stages of the contest, the Terminator would unleash an ocean of lead in the direction of his zombified opponent. Stunned but absorbing the damage, Jason collapses to the ground. Believing his target dead, the Terminator turns away, only to have his field of view filled with Jason's towering stature and lifeless eyes gleaming at him through the narrow holes in his mask. Within an instant, Jason attacks with his machete, slicing clean through the shotgun that the Terminator raised to block the attack. In response, the cyborg kicks Jason square in the chest, sending him careening backwards into one of the nearby vehicles. As Jason lays dazed, the machine marches forward, unleashing a flurry of fully automatic destruction into the decaying figure laying in the wreckage. Distance now closed, the Terminator scans for vital signs, finding none, just as the zombie springs to his feet and instantly knocks him back several feet into one of the concrete pillars behind him. As both upright themselves, the Terminator directly questions how Jason is not dead. Jason offers no response. Instead, he immediately turns away and vanishes behind one of the concrete support pillars. As the Terminator takes aim, the Deadeye inexplicably reappears and disappears between the columns, continuously throwing off the cyborg's aim, causing him to expend all of his ammo in the process, until he spawns behind him and slashes the cyborg directly across the face, peeling away a massive chunk of flesh. Taken aback by the metallic figure under the quote of flesh, Jason does not anticipate the Terminator's grip snapping the blade of his weapon, along with the crushing force of a headbutt that completely shatters his mask, revealing his decaying face hidden beneath. With no knowledge on how to defeat what they see, both are left with only one tactic remaining: brute force. The brawl would be bloody and brutal. The combatants would collide with one another, causing as much damage to the scenery around them as they do to each other. Their figures would be sent flying, loose objects would be thrown and hammered into each other. The minutes would be long and arduous, with neither giving ground. Bones would crack and metal would creak as they each target skeletal joints. But eventually, one outlasts the other. In the midst of a grapple, the might of Jason's undead strength slams his foot into the machine's knee, causing no pain, but bringing the cyborg down to a limp. With an opportunity now presented, Jason ignores the Terminator's excruciating grip atop his wrists as he wrestles the machine to the ground. The Terminator attempts to outright himself, only to be pinned by the weight of a nearby car, flipped over by his undead counterpart. Jason retrieves the shattered remnant of his favorite weapon. Casting a shadow over the mechanical monstrosity that disturbed his crusade, he repeatedly stabs into the cyborg's neck until he manages to slide the broken blade clean through. Then, with supernatural vigor, he grips both sides, twisting and thrusting until he rips the metallic skull clean from the body of his most resolute victim yet. And to conclude, Jason Voorhees, the Crystal Lake Killer, is declared the victor in this year's Halloween special. I'm not gonna lie, this was a hard one. I really hope you guys enjoyed the video, as I've been looking forward to this one for a long time. If you did enjoy, feel free to leave a like on the video, as it helps me out immensely. Feel free to subscribe and follow me on Twitter for more content, and to keep up to date with everything. As always, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, I hope you all have an awesome Halloween.